Am I on? Yeah. Welcome, everyone, to this first plenary session, EU Relations in Turbulent Times. And they are indeed turbulent times. Jean-Michel yesterday spoke in his introductory remarks of the perma-crises that have faced the European Union. Many of those are domestic, from the financial and debt crisis, the surge in migration, energy security, indeed security more generally, and the rise of the radical right and democratic backsliding, and of course the loss of one of its largest member states. And globally, we are not short of crises today, and all of that is putting pressure on relations within the European Union, on public administration within the European Union, and the relationships that I guess many of us took for granted externally, all now facing new challenges amid new global threats. So to discuss all of these, we are joined by three prestigious speakers. I'm very delighted to introduce you to them all. Professor Sabine Kuhlmann is one of the most recognized and influential German public administration scientists, a scholar of comparative public administration. She has held the chair of political science for political science administration and organization at the University of Potsdam since 2013, and is deputy chairwoman of the National Regulatory Control Council, which reviews federal government laws for bureaucratic costs for businesses and administration, and has advised many of the governments and the lender administrations across Germany. Professor Anand Menon is Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London and Director of the UK in a Changing Europe. The UK in a Changing Europe is an academic think tank that has provided really crucial, impartial, research-based analysis and guidance and advice on the UK's changing relationship with the European Union in the run-up to the Brexit referendum and the aftermath of Brexit negotiations, and the ongoing dynamics in that relationship, and we'll hear more of his views on all of that shortly. Professor Alasdair Roberts is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His most recent book, The Adaptable Country, How Canada Can Survive the 21st Century, was published last year and is a finalist in the Shaughnessy-Cohen Prize for Political Writing. 9 earlier books have received 5 book awards as well, and he is a much decorated political scientist, and I'm delighted that he's been able to join us here today. In 2022, he received the Riggs Award for Lifetime Achievement in International and Comparative Public Administration. So we are, first of all, going to hear from our speakers. Sabine will invite you to provide a presentation, and then Anand and Alasdair will provide some of their thoughts. We'll go to roundtable discussion, and there will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions and join in the discussion later on. So without further ado, Sabine, can I invite you to take the floor? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, for this nice introduction. Thanks also for inviting me to this plenary. I'm very happy to contribute. And I have chosen the title for my presentation, connected, of course, to the title of this plenary session, Public Administration in Turbulent Times. How do current challenges impact on public administration in Europe and beyond? And what I want to do in this brief presentation is to look at which challenges is public administration facing as an object of research, so public administration as an institution, as an organization on the one hand, but also public administration as a discipline, as a field of research. So which challenges are we facing in these two dimensions, and what could be a future role of EGPA here in this context as we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of EGPA? So I'm starting with PA as an object of research in an era of polycrisis, as Nicola mentioned. Permacrisis, polycrisis is one of the key words in recent times. Then outline some opportunities and challenges PA as a discipline is facing, and finally outlook to the future role of EGPA. Public administrations are facing, in many countries, major challenges, major crises, which is called more recently the polycrisis, overlapping, cascading, permanent and acute crisis from different angles. This slide is meant to show also the European multi-level system in addressing these crises, because it's not just one single administrative unit or one level being addressed by crisis, but in Europe we have many countries these multi-level structure, which with the municipal, the Länder, regional level, national level, and the European Union as the upper level here in these multi-level systems. And the question arises, is European PA prepared to these acute and creeping crises, polycrisis? Is traditional, and in many countries, Weberian-style bureaucratic administration well prepared for such a new situation of different kinds of crises and overlapping, cascading crisis such as the polycrisis? And how can the functioning of public administration be assured when stress levels are rapidly rising? So this is something which not all administrative systems are used to handle, and so it's a new challenge to react in these acute situations when the stress level is rising. And for us as scholars, the question is then, how can public administration be prepared for these kinds of crises as a normative frame, as a normative question? So what we observe is that crisis density and complexity and duration of crisis are growing. Public administration must navigate these overlapping, cascading, interlinked crises. And there's increasingly an interplay between acute, sudden shocks on the one hand, and chronic stressors, such as climate crisis, social cleavages, trust crisis, on the other hand. So these kinds of polycrisis scenarios, as we call them in literature, call for more adaptive, agile approaches, multi-actor approaches, coordination across sectors, policy integration. There were papers in several sessions on policy integration, so more integrative approaches, intergovernmental collaboration, instead of what we know from the old bureaucratic Weberian administration, instead of compartmentalized structures, silos, reactive routines, which then in these situations fail to deliver. Especially as we are talking here as well about the multi-level perspective, subnational levels, especially for subnational entities, municipalities, local governments, regional governments, crisis management becomes more and more a permanent task which has to be aligned and embedded in everyday service delivery. So there's a kind of a parallel necessity of delivering regular services on the one hand, but also respond to major crises. And it more and more becomes such a kind of a permanent task. Yet what we also observe in many countries, and Germany is an interesting example here, is a debate about administrative failures, institutional failures, overload, unpreparedness or ill-preparedness to crisis, and which to us as administrative scholars raises then the question, so how can administration be reshuffled, be reformed, and be better prepared to respond to these crises, to avoid such failures, which has happened in a number of cases. And so just to have Germany as one of the examples, and it just serves as an example for a multi-level system responding to crisis, faced with crisis, but trying to respond to these crises. And what we can see from the German case, which you all know, it's a federal system, it's a multi-level system with a strong regional Länder governments and strong local governments. There are some institutions in this multi-level system which are, I would argue, resilience promoting, and other factors or properties which are resilience inhibiting. So what are the resilience promoting institutions in such a multi-level system? So on the one hand, it's of course the flexibility and agility of decentralized settings with strong subnational units, with strong autonomous multifunctional local governments which can respond locally and deliver tailor-made solutions to local problems, which can give agile responses and pragmatic solutions in these situations. They are experienced, in the German case at least, to tackling crisis, to tackling transformations, as we have seen with East Germany having performed this huge transformation in the 1990s. And we have the classic Weberian administrative tradition, which guarantees and ensures that there is still a legal correctness of action and equal treatment, even in situations of crisis, and procedural legitimacy in the process. However, this system is also faced with challenges, and I would call it resilience inhibiting institutions. Because the administrative federalism, on the one hand agile and pragmatic, on the other hand causes high costs of coordination. So there's much coordination to be done across the levels of government. Centralized responses are very difficult in such a setting. So we had many problems in Germany to respond centrally from the federal level to the pandemic crisis, to the refugee crisis. And so central responses, which are sometimes called for in crisis situations, are difficult to achieve in such a setting. So this causes problems for crisis management, collaboration, communication. And within the classical administrative system, the Weberian bureaucratic system, there are not many incentives to work in a pragmatic way in crisis situations. So there are regulatory burdens, there are bureaucratic procedures. There is also a cultural resistance coming from the civil servants to react in a pragmatic manner, to find solutions instead of being only legally correct. So that's also an issue of administrative culture, which in times of crisis causes problems and causes frictions in the administrative systems. So the legalist culture, on the one hand, an advantage, but on the other hand, a problem in situations of acute crisis has sometimes a tendency to over-regulate problems, problem solutions, or even mal-regulation as a problem, over-perfection, over-regulation, which I have called in one of my papers as a kind of an over-Weberianization, when we talk about the neo-Weberian state as a new paradigm, model. So there could also be a tendency of over-Weberianization, over-bureaucratization. And just to give you one element of evidence here, this is taken from data which we have, Nicola mentioned it, in the Regulatory Control Council, which measures all the bureaucratic burdens coming from new federal legislation in Germany. And we see over the last 15 years or so, the regulatory burdens have more than doubled in Germany, which means these are compliance costs for businesses, administration, and citizens coming from new federal legislation, including the implementation of EU laws. And so you see this rising line here, which shows us there is some tendency of more regulation, red tape, and there's the question, is that the right answer to these kinds of polycrises? So let me come finally to PA as a discipline. What are the challenges for PA as a discipline? Challenges and opportunities in these situations of the perma and poly crisis. So I would argue on the one hand, there are opportunities because these real life challenges, some of which I have outlined here, are opportunities for research. So we see more comparative research regarding crisis management, crisis governance, how different countries cope with major crises such as the pandemic, such as migration policies, climate change. So also from my experience of being the editor-in-chief of the International Review of Administrative Sciences, IRIS, I see more comparative papers being submitted on these issues of the crisis, of the poly crisis. Papers are more dealing with intergovernmental and local dimensions of public administration because they are getting more and more important in these kinds of crisis circumstances. The interlinkages between bureaucracy and democracy are addressed. Because democracy to some extent also gets threatened in crisis situations when bureaucracy takes over and sometimes forgets about the legitimacy of the measures. So these linkages become more important in research. And there seems to be, in times of crisis, also a kind of rehabilitation of the state. So while new public management and all this privatization, managerial reforms were much about privatizing, about rolling back the state, minimizing the state, there seems to be a kind of calming back of the state in recent years. And so this is also something which we observe as an opportunity for us as researchers of public administration. So a number of opportunities for us in these times of crisis where we study public administration. And so I would say, yes, public administration, comparative research in Europe is prospering and advancing. On the other hand, we also face challenges in these times of crisis. As you all know, in these times of geopolitical polarizations, I think we will also talk in this plenary about this, geopolitical polarizations, wars, Brexit, and all these things of cleavages, for us as scholars, collaborations become more and more difficult. Some long-standing partnerships have been interrupted or becoming more complicated due to these global tensions. So it gets more and more difficult to collaborate, to work together, to build bridges, which we need in our community. There are national austerity policies limiting the resources of scholars, young scholars. It's more and more difficult to come to conferences, to travel, to publish in journals when you have to pay fees, and so on. So austerity policies are impacting negatively on our discipline. There is what we see in our conferences, but also in paper submissions in IRIS, is an underrepresentation of some countries and regions. Just to name Eastern Europe, Global South. So there seems to be more and more biased country presentation. Of course, we have all these developments in the publishing industry, which is also a pressure on scholars. Some governments reduce their support to public administration community. Just to name as an example that within the IIS there has been an exit of some country governments to support it, to continue support, such as the French example, where the government just withdraw its support. And as you all know, we have within our community tendencies of drifting apart, which are difficult for such a, let me say, small community, and public administration is smaller than some other disciplines. So it poses challenges in our community to work together, to bridge tensions, and to be creative, to be productive. So that is part of the challenges. Final slide, looking ahead, as we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of EGPA. So I think, and EGPA represents the European voice of public administration, and it used to do so over the last 50 years. And I think it's more important than ever to have this loud and unified voice of the European public administration in the context of these geopolitical tensions and conflicts, to bridge these cleavages, to deal with the cleavages, to have comparative research on these cleavages. So we should, as a European community of public administration, reaffirm and strengthen our role in the global and European public administration community to respond to pressing problems in Europe and beyond. So we need a globally, not just European-oriented, but a globally oriented comparative research and community cross-cultural academic collaboration and networking instead of European isolation. Let me frame it like this. And EGPA here is a unique platform that brings together academics, but also practitioners, pracademics, on a joint platform and on neutral grounds. And that's why I close my presentation with a statement that EGPA plays a vital role in advancing evidence-based decision-making, nurturing the next generation of public administrators and leaders, and therefore I wish EGPA a bright future and no less success than for the next 50 years as a forum that remains vibrant, inclusive, reflective, and responsive, fostering dialogue and global collaboration to evolving needs of Europe's societies and beyond. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sabine. Straight to you, Anand.
Thanks, Nicola. Well, nothing says the end of summer holidays quite like being asked to talk about Brexit for 15 minutes at the end of August. But we have to talk about Brexit, and we have to talk about Brexit partly because there's a big Brexit year coming up. Next June will mark the 10th anniversary of the referendum, and an awful lot has happened in those 10 years that I'll try and sketch out to you briefly in my remarks. And secondly, I think, particularly for people from outside the United Kingdom, it was probably quite hard to grasp just how all-consuming Brexit was in this country. If you think back to that period between 2016 and 2020, Brexit was the only thing we did. We effectively weren't governed because the government was tying itself in knots, trying to figure out how to leave the European Union. There was a moment in January 2019 when Theresa May first failed to get her deal through Parliament, where the viewing figures for BBC Parliament for the first time ever were higher than the viewing figures for MTV, as the whole world sort of tuned in to watch this psychodrama that we were going through. And, you know, with the passage of time and with all the things that have happened since Brexit, I think it's easy to forget just what a period of time that was, how divisive it was, how disruptive it was, how all-consuming it was. And I think there are a couple of things about Brexit that strike me now. The first is just the scale of the impact it had. No one at the time of the referendum was talking properly just about the scale of change that leaving the European Union would impose on a country like the United Kingdom. And in that sense, I mean, paradoxically, Brexit proved the Eurosceptics right. It turned out that the European Union, after all, did have a huge impact on every single area of national life in this country. And unpicking that relationship proved, I think, to many people, including many policymakers who were unaware of it at the time, just how pervasive those impacts were. But the second paradox about Brexit, I think, which is worth thinking about, is just how deeply unimportant it is in political debate these days in the United Kingdom. And that's something worth reflecting on, I think, because it tells us something about where this country has got to. So where are we now? Well, we're in a situation where we're able to look at data about what Brexit has meant for this country and to come to some conclusions about how it has impacted all aspects of our lives. The most obvious is economic. The Office for Budget Responsibility routinely trots out this figure of 4%, meaning 4% of GDP being the cost of Brexit to the UK economy. We've had detailed studies now that show beyond any shadow of a doubt that goods trade has been significantly impacted. And goods trade, not just between the UK and the European Union, but UK global goods trade is down compared to where it should be because of Brexit, because of course we live in a time of global supply chains. If we're exporting something to China and some of the bits that go into that thing are made in the European Union, Brexit has an impact on that trade with China. So Brexit is impacting on our trade. It's impacting particularly on smaller businesses. One of the things we've found is that a load of small businesses that used to trade quite frequently with the European Union no longer do so, simply because they can't afford the compliance tests. They haven't got the resources to fill in the customs forms, to deal with the paperwork. This should come as a surprise to no one in this room, because as social scientists, you're aware that making trade harder, making trade more expensive, is going to exert a downward pressure on trade. But we now have the figures to prove it, and what's happening in goods trade is being replicated more damagingly for the UK because we're a services economy in terms of our services trade. There was a period, I think, where we hoped that services trade would weirdly escape unhurt by Brexit, partly because we learned to do so much of it remotely during COVID. So academics can do their lectures without getting a visa because you can do it by Zoom and still illegally get the check in the post a few days later and no one would know about it. So we found ways around some of the paperwork of Brexit, but there's been new data out in the last 4 or 5 months that shows even when it comes to services trade, the UK economy has been significantly impacted. Brexit also, and I don't think we talk about this enough, completely redrew the rules of politics in this country. If you look at the electoral geography of the United Kingdom now, it bears very little resemblance to the electoral geography back in 2015. And the key reason for that is that Brexit catalyzed, it didn't create because it was there beforehand, but it catalyzed a division amongst voters that had never really been salient in electoral politics beforehand, but became electorally salient after Brexit. And that is the division, not the traditional one, between left and right, that we're always used to talking about. How big should the state be? How high should your taxes be? How much should we redistribute? But between social liberals and social conservatives. You get at that by asking questions about things like the death penalty, like discipline in schools, views on trans rights, gender equality, things like that. Brexit divided the country along its social values. And what that did was bleed into electoral results, which means that in the elections of 2017 and 2019, and also to some extent, though it was a weird one, in 2024, we see Labour and the Conservatives winning seats they had no earthly right to win under the old politics. Why? Because people weren't voting on the back of their economic interests anymore, they were voting on the back of their social values. So politics has been profoundly changed, and it's one of the reasons why, if you look at opinion polling in the United Kingdom now, we have these unbelievable eye-watering levels of volatility. Our first past the post system, which was already creaking in 2015, has been dealt another hammer blow by this new division of Brexit, because it means increasing volatility plus increasing fragmentation means we have what our system should not do, a five-party system competing under first past the post. And finally, there's the constitutional dimension, which again, I think we ignore at our peril. We heard from Sabine that actually one of the things that causes a degree of resilience in the face of global uncertainty are institutions that can provide long-term stability. In leaving the European Union, Britain lost one of those institutions. Because of our constitutional system, the nearest thing we have to quasi-constitutional law was European law. European law was the only form of law in the United Kingdom that could not be overturned by a simple majority in Parliament. That law now no longer applies in the way it once did to the United Kingdom, which means everything is more fragile than it used to be. When Nigel Farage stands up and says, well, we'll just scrap those laws, he can do that because you can do anything you want in Parliament. Parliament can decide from one day to the next, for instance, that Rwanda is a safe country. And there is very little in the way of checks and balances to stop that happen, particularly absent that safety net that European integration provided against executive excess. So we have all these things going on, plus constitutionally, of course, because of the nature of our system, and Nicola is the person to talk to about this, we had a system of devolution that was predicated on membership in the European Union. The devolution system we had with Scotland, and particularly with Northern Ireland, only worked the way it worked because we were within this cushion of single market and customs union. And one of the things that we've seen since Brexit, of course, is the whole devolution question being reopened. Who has the right to make laws? If Scotland has different regulations to England, what does that mean for the functioning of, and this is a new phrase we've all had to get used to, the UK's internal market? How do you deal with the fact, and it's an absurd fact on one level, that within the same sovereign territory, you now have customs and regulatory checks on trade between two parts of that sovereign territory. So Brexit has unsettled all parts of this country. It's also unsettled public opinion, it's worth saying very quickly at the end, because public opinion is in an interesting place. A significant majority of the British people will now tell you that Brexit was a bad idea, but an even bigger majority of the British public will tell you the last thing I want in the world is to have that debate again. We've arrived in terms of public opinion at a very, very British place. We kind of regret what we've done, but there's no way we're going to do anything about it because actually that just feels a little bit too hard and a little bit too divisive. So let's just stick with where we are now. The public do not want to go back to the Brexit debates of the past. Now, where is this government taking us? We have this much vaunted reset of relations with the European Union. It's a reset that, to put it kindly, is profoundly limited. It's a reset that involves tinkering around the edges with the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson signed to make some slight improvements in the area of agricultural trade, and I'll come back to this in a minute, to do quite a lot in the area of security. But what is interesting about this government's approach to Brexit is that Brexit is now co-owned. The fact that Keir Starmer put his signature on the outcome of the May summit means Labour too have dipped their hands in the blood of Brexit and are co-signatories to a Brexit situation that we know and they know is costing our economy a significant amount of growth every single year. And what is interesting about this is, with some exceptions, such as the SNP here in Scotland, but in terms of the national debate, no one is now questioning Brexit anymore. The Liberal Democrats do every now and again, but one of the most interesting things about the Liberal Democrats is whilst their formal position is to rejoin the European Union, it is a position they never, ever talk about publicly because they too are scared of upsetting Leave-inclined voters by appearing to question Brexit. Now, just very, very quickly on the geopolitics of all of this. All of this has taken place in the context of the new Trump administration. And one of the initial impacts of the Trump administration was to drive the UK and the EU closer to each other because of a recognition of the fact that we're going to have to do more for our own security. One of the great unanswered questions about geopolitics at the moment isn't whether the Americans are going to do less for European security, but how they're going to go about doing less for European security. We could, on the one hand, and this is the benign scenario, have an ordered, negotiated drawdown of American forces in Europe. That would give Europe time to respond. It would be done in collaboration. We would coordinate over how this worked in practice. The nasty scenario is one where the US goes from being an ally to being an adversary, where the US starts to want to work more closely with President Putin. We've heard shades of this already. The Portuguese defense minister 3 months ago gave a press conference in which he said, we're going to have to cancel our purchase of American F-35s because we don't trust the Americans not to turn the software off if we want to use them. That is the unbenign scenario of American withdrawal, and it's something that both the Brits and the European Union are wrestling with, which explains why we have a security treaty with the Germans, a new security, redone security arrangement with the French, and a security and defense deal with the European Union. Trump is pushing us closer together, but, and it's a big but, here we arrive at some of the problems with the European Union itself. Europe has for decades talked a good game about doing more for its own security. It has never, over the last 30 years, actually delivered on those promises. And one of the profound tensions halting European integration at the moment, I think, is that when it talks about security, it talks in warm terms about partnerships with the United Kingdom, with Norway, with Canada, and so on. When it talks about economics, it talks about, in far more restrictive terms, about protecting European supply chains, about avoiding dependence on third parties who are outside the single market. How that debate progresses within the European Union is going to be fundamental to how the relationship between the UK and the EU develops over time. If the EU takes a more expansive view of the economics of security, that allows the UK, if you like, to dock into some of the EU military spending programs and for us to work more closely together when it comes to developing the armed forces we will need to replace the United States. If the European Union insists on maintaining this rather closed economic attitude, it leaves countries like the UK on the outside, which has negative consequences for the security of all of us. Finally, one last point, because you can't really talk about anything in Britain without talking about this nowadays. There's Nigel Farage and Reform UK. And I think here it's worth putting things into perspective. The rise of populism in this country is not happening because of things that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years. The rise of populism in this country is happening because for the best part of 20 years, median wages in the United Kingdom have simply not gone up. For the best part of 20 years, growth in this country has been anemic. And Nigel Farage is taking advantage of this long-term disillusionment and long-term frustration with the inability of politics to deliver. And if you think about it, the UK economy has suffered a series of what should have been once-in-a-generation blows in the space of 2 decades. We had the great financial crisis, which affected us more than anyone else because of our reliance on financial services. We had the failed experiment with austerity. We had Brexit. We had COVID. We had the cost of living crisis spawned by the war in Ukraine. We have had to deal with an unprecedented series of economic crises. The problem we have now is that finally, the patience of the UK public with a governing elite that has not managed to generate the growth they've come to expect is starting to wear thin. And so without being too sort of dramatic about this government has 3.5 years to show that they can do things better, to avoid the danger of a Farage-led or a government including Farage, which will have massive implications in terms of our relationship with our European partners. Thank you.
Perfect. Alasdair, we'll go straight to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Alasdair Roberts. I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst in the United States, although I feel constrained to point out that I'm actually a Canadian citizen working in the United States. Seems appropriate at this moment in history just to flag that. As it happens, I'm also a British citizen because my parents were from Falkirk and Stirling here in Scotland. So it's nice to be back in a country of familiar accents. I have a number of cousins in North America, all of whom, after Brexit, realized that our British passports weren't quite as useful as they once had been. And many of them had this sort of similar thought, well, you know, and now that we think about it, aren't we actually Irish? And since I'm the one who went to law school, I was the one who was charged with putting the brief together. It turns out Scotland has a wonderful website called Scotland's People. It's sort of a one-stop shop for genealogical information, and so I was charged with putting the brief together. It turns out we do indeed have Irish forebears. My great-great-grandparents, James and Agnes McQuillan, migrated from Ireland to Glasgow in 1842, not quite good enough for an Irish passport. But oddly, they landed, there's a plaque right beside my hotel that marks the place where many Irish emigrants landed in Glasgow. I'm sure because of the complimentary breakfast. So it turns out we're not that Irish after all. So we've given up on that tactic. We're now hardcore advocates of the SNP. So my job today is just to say a few words about the geopolitical situation that's emerging and how that will affect the EU and other countries. I'm going to advance briefly 5 propositions. So let me just proceed. It's common to say that since 1945, all of us live in a world of states, of which there are, give or take a few, 194 countries or states around the world. Obviously, they're not all created equal. So proposition 1 is that we are living in and will continue to live in a world order that is dominated by 5 large political systems. China, actually I should put India first, India in terms of population first, then China, the United States, and the European Union, counting it as a political system. I will throw in Russia, although that's a more tendentious proposition at the moment. About half of the world's population lives in just those 5, within those just 5 systems, and those 5 systems account for two-thirds of world GDP. I should acknowledge that there's a sort of second tier of large states that are also contenders. They're Bangladesh, Brazil, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Indonesia. But once you take those top 10, which account for about more than 60% of world population, you're left with about 160 states that account for the remaining 40%. The average population of those big 10 states is about 20 times the average population of the other states. There's an order of magnitude difference. Proposition 2 is that these large systems, and here I'm thinking specifically of what I will call the sort of big 5, are all unnatural formations. By which I mean to say they're systems with a large amount of inherent fragility. Chinese leaders often say that one of their principal preoccupations is stability maintenance. And I'll argue that one of the principal preoccupations of leaders in all of these systems is exactly that, stability maintenance. The one state we might have said, well, doesn't quite fit the bill. If we'd been talking about this 15 or 20 years ago, we would have said, well, the United States doesn't preoccupy itself with stability maintenance. And I think fairly clearly that the world is shifting in that sense as well. So all of these systems, these large systems, are struggling with the question of how to organize themselves and how to maintain stability in circumstances that are already difficult and likely to become more difficult in coming decades, because of all of the factors we're familiar with: climatic change, technological change, demographic transformations, and so on. Proposition 3 is that this sort of basic regime task of stability maintenance can be made easier or harder by regime design, by system design. And I would argue, if I were looking, for example, at the United States today, we put a lot of emphasis on Donald Trump and his eccentricities, but the problem in the United States is not a problem of personality or the particular qualities of the leader, or rather not exclusively that. My view is that the more fundamental problem in the United States is a problem of regime design. More specifically, the American system has become dangerously over-centralized over the last century in 2 respects. Authority has shifted from lower levels of government up to Washington, and authority in Washington has shifted from other parts of government toward the office of the president. So horizontal and vertical centralization. This has been a century-long bipartisan project. And that project of centralization today has had unintended consequences. Problems of overload and gridlock at the center, problem of societal polarization that's actually intensified by the battle for control of central authority, and the spawning of massive programs that are hard to manage and hard to reform. So that's sort of the third proposition, that regime design can complicate the task of stability maintenance, and my particular concern is with over-centralization. The fourth proposition is, and here I'm coming at it from as a Canadian, for the 160 small states in the world, one of the major issues in coming decades is going to be how to deal with these large supersized systems that are increasingly preoccupied with the problem of stability maintenance. If I had to predict, I would say that these large systems are going to behave more erratically in coming decades, and they will be more inwardly focused. More of their mental energy will be focused on their own preoccupations, their own aches and pains, as it were. So what I think we see coming from Washington today, policy instability and internal preoccupations, I think is going to be the new normal, not just for the United States, but for other large systems in coming decades. And small states are going to be preoccupied with the question of how to deal with this. And we can already see small states wrestling with the options. Do you act as a supplicant? Do you use diplomacy in an effort to sort of cultivate favor with the large state? Do you buy insurance policies like increasing your defense spending? Do you attempt to reduce dependence by strategies like trade diversification? There'll be lots of experimentation with these various kinds of coping strategies, and it's worth noting they're all costly. So that's one observation. Of course, the European Union itself, in its dealings with the other large supersized systems, is going to be grappling with similar questions. How do you deal with the policy instability that's being generated by other systems? There's also a question of how the European Union should structure itself in response to coming challenges. And here I want to just return to the predicament of centralization. When you put that array of supersized systems out there, obviously the European Union is much less centralized than any of the other large systems. Having said that, the EU is also more centralized than it was decades ago. There is a tendency towards centralization in the European system over time. And it's also true that there is this pattern of crisis and centralization that appears to operate in the EU. A crisis or a shock hits the system, and the prescription is in one way or another increasing the authority of Brussels. And we can see today pressure to centralize further operating within Europe. And that pressure to centralize might be justified in many ways. It might be an argument that it's necessary to centralize for collective defense, or to promote economic competitiveness, or to promote strategic autonomy, and so on. Ursula von der Leyen gave a speech a few months ago in which she said, "The real question facing Europe is whether it's prepared to act decisively as the situation dictates and with the speed and ambition that is needed." And that's the sort of talk that usually is a prelude to discussion about the need to centralize and streamline decision-making. That's one argument about why you want to centralize. Another is you want to make your system impervious to tactics of division and conquering by other competitors. And there's a certain degree of isomorphic centralization that goes on. If your competitors are all centralized, there's a tendency to think you ought to be as well, that there's something unnatural about a picture in which you have one American president and several European leaders on the other side of the frame. So I would predict that there will be continued pressure for centralization. I just want to conclude with my fifth proposition, which is that the EU should be very careful, very wary about these pressures to centralize. That grants of authority to the center in very large systems like the EU should be strictly limited and conditional. And in a way, you might say, well, I'm sort of affirming the principle of subsidiarity, and I'm doing that not so much on the basis of the virtues of localism, but what I think are the clear pathologies of centralism. The dangers that arise when you over-centralize a system that I think are being illustrated by American politics today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alasdair, and to all of our speakers. We have about 30 minutes left for questions, and I have colleagues with roving mics. So if people would like to ask a question or make a contribution, please raise your hands. And since I don't see any yet, I'm going to give you a moment to have a little think and ask some of myself. And Sabine, I was struck when you were talking about the challenges in public administration and thinking back to COVID. And it's often said that COVID, the pandemic, mobilized public administration very quickly, very rapidly to change things. Talking to a colleague just the other day, when they were in the Scottish context, we were talking about how street-level homelessness was eradicated like that because they did it and they had to do it and they were able to mobilize. And you hear it quite often, why can't we do that now? Is it because of the poly-crisis that you talked? There's too many multiple demands at the same time, or is there something in the system design that stops that?
I think there are a couple of explanations. I think public administration in general reacts quite agilely in times of acute problems and acute challenges. It is then able to react and needs external pressure. So this is what we very commonly teach to our students. If you want to achieve profound changes in an administrative system, you need to have external pressures. It will not happen from inside endogenously, so you need this kind of external pressure. So then there is a reaction in acute situations. However, this ability of agile reactions, of being pragmatic, obviously doesn't persist over time. So when we are in non-crisis situations or less pressure situations, there seems to be a reversion or a coming back of public administration to traditional routines, to established procedures. They seem to forget somehow that they were able to react differently in a crisis situation. And so this has to do, I think, with a number of structural constraints. I was talking about the Weberian bureaucracy of the classical Weberian principles, which are deeply enshrined in public administration, deeply historically rooted, particularly in continental European systems as Germany, as France, Italy, which are very much shaped by bureaucratic cultures. And so this is a kind of cultural historic legacy of public administration, which you cannot easily overcome by one acute situation or one pressure. So then there is this kind of returning to the routines. And maybe one last point, what we see, however, over time, that in the times of the perma-crisis, the poly-crisis, that there is incremental change. So it's not the one transformation, changing administrative systems, but incremental change over time, which changes mindsets, institutions, structures, but it is not one upheaval or one transformation, but more an incremental change, which differs across countries again. So as a comparative scholar, we see, of course, different reactions also regarding the centralization topic, which I find very, very inspiring, this centralization hypothesis, which I would also support, but we see differences across countries in this trend towards centralization or maybe also towards decentralization. And so we need to take into account these country differences as well.
Yeah. Anand, if I can come to you, and I was struck by listening to Alasdair's contribution at the absence of the United Kingdom in that picture that you were painting. And of course, that's not a surprise to you or me or to many people in this room. I wonder, though, if it is a surprise to those who lead the United Kingdom. Is there recognition and acknowledgement, post-Brexit in particular, that the United Kingdom is just not that an important power anymore?
Yeah, you're right. I think it would come as a surprise to many of our leaders. It's been a really difficult decade for the UK and its place in international politics. If you had to write a list of things that we wouldn't want to happen after leaving the European Union, a return to protectionism, the gradual erosion of globalization, and increasing tensions with the United States would have been the top three things that we really didn't want to happen, and they've all happened. So being the UK at the moment is quite a lonely place to be. And one of the things that Keir Starmer has done very, very well to date, I think, is to build solid links with both Washington and Brussels. He's done that, it's required some quite difficult occasions with President Trump in Washington, but he's managed to sort of square that circle quite well. The danger for us comes if, let's just say that the EU and the US find themselves in an escalating trade war, or there's a battle of words between Brussels and Washington. Being the United Kingdom suddenly becomes very, very difficult because we have to find a way of squaring that circle when we might get pressure from each side to throw our lot in with them. So, yeah, we are a relatively small power in a world of big powers and struggling to make our voice heard by sort of selective alignment, and it's going to be very, very difficult to do.
Can you say something more? Because Keir Starmer entered office with a commitment to reset the relationship with the European Union, and we've heard a lot of that language of reset. What substantively has that meant?
Substantively, it's meant very little, actually. It's meant at the summit, I mean, essentially, if you go back to the summit that happened in May, the only thing they agreed about was fish. Okay, that was the only agreement they actually came out with. They've also agreed to have negotiations on other things like an agricultural deal. But even the government's own estimates suggest that if we sign that agricultural deal, it'll be about 0.5% of GDP in terms of benefit, which compared to the 4% of being outside the single market and the customs union is obviously relatively trivial. So in practical terms, the reset has been as much about tone as about substance, which is to say, Starmer has done well in terms of rebuilding personal relationships, both with national European leaders and with the European Union. And that's not to be sniffed at, but it's not substantive in the sense of a meaningful economic improvement.
And Alasdair, if I may come to you, and I am coming to the room after that, so please be ready with your questions. I read in your wonderful book where you talked about the EU as always being afflicted by a sense of imminent catastrophe, but somehow finding the way to muddle through. And I wonder if that was a reflection on the EU and during its development, but where stands the EU now in that sense of imminent catastrophe? And is there something in the regime design that makes, maybe in the context of the poly-crises that Sabine talked about, muddling through more challenging than it might have been before?
Sorry, could you rephrase the last bit? Is there something about
is there something in the regime design of the European Union that might make that capacity to muddle through? And I think you said in your book, retrospectively, they've done not bad in muddling through in the face of catastrophe, but given the multiple crises, internally and in external relations, is muddling through enough?
Well, I suppose the argument might be that there's muddling through might not be a bad outcome, given the circumstances. And there's a temptation to think, well, if we sort of centralize the system, the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And I think the argument I would make is that when you're looking at regime design, you're looking at a choice of pathologies. And Sabine, you sort of flagged them on your chart, that the grass is not greener on the other side of the fence, and that perhaps in the long run, if you want to think about systemic resilience, there is a virtue to decentralization, notwithstanding all the flaws you see in terms of the costs of coordination and so on.
Yeah. And you painted the picture for us that, of course, was visible for everybody to see of the European leaders in the White House surrounding Donald Trump in a sense, showing solidarity to Ukraine. But we've also, I guess, borne witness to the absence of the EU giving voice and speaking about the crisis in the Middle East. And yet, these are our near neighbours, they are our fellow citizens, and the repercussions will be felt everywhere. What does that tell us about the EU's status and authority on the global stage?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that question, so I'll pass.
All right. Colleagues, please. Yes, Sabine.
May I ask a question? Do you hear me? May I ask a question to you? Because I like this argument of the centralization as a, how do you call it, isomorphic centralization across regimes, across countries. And so it seems to be a kind of a trend in this poly-crisis situation, facing different problems or facing increasing challenges. But how do you then bring in the observation of devolution, of more regionalization in many countries, of strengthening the regional level, in some countries even strengthen the local level. So we see, as I'm also a local government researcher, we see an increase in autonomy, in local autonomy over the last decades. So there seems to be a kind of a counter-development to this centralization trend, maybe, which we also should take into account. So what
well, I think that's right, so I simplified the argument for the purposes of to stay within the time constraints. I mean, I think the argument I would make is that there are logics of centralism, there are logics of decentralization. They're both operative. It's not a story of relentless centralization. But if we were to look at those 5 large systems over the last century and look at the trend line, the argument I would make is that the trend line, the logics of centralization play out more strongly. And I think I would argue that there's also sort of a crisis-driven ratcheting that clearly operates in many of these cases.
Questions from the floor, please. You're very shy. Yes. It's just, where is the mic?
Perhaps
Just so that everyone in the room can hear. So just for this. Thanks.
Nicola, there's a question over there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Luisa Neto from Portugal. And my question goes to Alasdair. And I would like you, if you could please develop more your 4th proposition.
I can't remember which one that was. It's just the danger of lists. What was the 4th proposition? What's the point that you'd like me to elaborate? Oh, right. Well, that's the question of how the small states are going to deal with it. Well, so how do you deal? I'm Canadian. Prime Minister Mark Carney is dealing right now with the question of how do you deal with an unpredictable neighbor, right? So do you conciliate? Do you go to Washington? Are you a supplicant? How far do you go to do that? Do you try to, reduce? There's a wonderful book about resource dependence. It came out decades ago, and I've forgotten the title of it, but this is essentially the story that's playing out right now. Do you try to reduce your dependence on the neighbor through trade diversification? Is that even possible? Do you invest in mechanisms that are essentially, do you try to build your internal market? Do you do infrastructural investments to sort of deal with that? Do you build up defense, as I say, as sort of an insurance policy? So I would speculate there's going to be, certainly in Canada, there's going to be an immense amount, there's going to be a recreation of national strategy in Canada over the coming decade or so. The formulation of a new grand strategy for Canada that involves both domestic and foreign policy that reflects this new reality. Frankly, I don't think my American neighbors have quite appreciated the dramatic effect that recent events have had on the Canadian political psychology. This is undoubtedly a phase shift, this is regarded quite as a turning point in Canadian history. So there'll be and it's going to be, in the long run, some calculation about the best way of dealing with an erratic neighbor. But the point I've been trying to make to my Canadian friends is this isn't just about Trump. Don't imagine that if you satiate Trump or if you get past the next election, this is going to get better, because I would think the problem of policy instability and inwardness is going to be confronting Canadians for decades to come. And of course, lots of other medium-sized or small states are in exactly the same predicament.
There's a question over here, but just before we come to you, can I just ask you a follow-up on that? Has it also had an impact on Canadian unity, and in particular, the status of Quebec?
In the short run, it has, right? There's a sort of patriotic surge right now that will, I think, wear off in about a year. And then people will get back to the awkward questions about who pays for what and who does what and all the traditional Canadian issues.
Question over here, please.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Marlene Jubel. I was really inspired by especially this macro perspective, the geopolitical perspective, but also this long-term kind of view. And I'm wondering how we can incorporate that into our, smaller types of research that we do. So let's say in our papers, in our panels, we do not really speak about this very much, I think, although I think what came out here is that it's super relevant to think also in these bigger terms. So I'm wondering how we can reconcile these two. So that would actually be a question that might be asked to all three of you. And Alasdair gave this example of centralization in the US, which as you described has huge macro level effects. But when I think of how this may have been analyzed by public administration scholars, maybe sometimes we take more of a short-term perspective. We focus on just single outcomes, things like efficiency gains or so. So I'm really, really asking myself, how can we incorporate this bigger picture into our research? Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Sabine, can I come to you to have a first go at it?
Yeah, good question, I think, and I agree that it's somehow detached in our discipline. These broad geopolitical debates on the one hand, and our research on public administration, which is maybe more looking into the organization, which is closer to the individual institution, the countries, the comparative perspective. So I need to think about it. So one answer could be we should apply some of our frameworks of our analytical lenses probably to the geopolitical aspects. And I was inspired by this argument of the centralization, which you made, looking at the regimes at the very macro level, of course, but centralization is something we're dealing with as PA scholars. So it could be a link. So we should make up our minds, where do we have concepts and analytical frames which link up to these broader questions? And I think this is one way, centralization, decentralization. I think all the question of how to deal with crisis, how to deal with erratic neighbors could also be dealt with from a PA perspective. How do administrations react here? What is the relation between politics and administration? Could be something related to geopolitical questions too. Populism, of course, we are talking about populism, about democratic backsliding. I think these are questions related also to geopolitical aspects. So therefore, I think the link is there. It is probably not visible enough and not very dominating in our discipline so far.
Alasdair?
So I did this book a few years ago called Strategies for Governing, which must be selling very briskly because every time I go into a bookstore, they never have a copy. But it's a critique, basically, of American public administration specifically. And I would argue that American public administration, I don't know if saying that it took a wrong turn is probably too strong, but it took a turn about 40 years ago toward this sort of public management approach, which is a very sort of meso or micro level approach to the field of public administration, away from a macro level approach that looked at questions of regime design, state design, and so on, which is unfortunate. And one of the difficulties over the last 10 years, I'll say, is that we've really realized the Achilles heel of that turn, the inability of the field to address the sort of profound questions that governments are facing in the current era. And I think that what scholars need is a license to think about macro level or systemic or regime level questions. They need a license from the field to do that, a recognition that it's appropriate kind of scholarship. They also need a license to think prospectively, that is to speculate about what the future might look like, even if they can't run a regression analysis about it, and speculate about what alternative regime designs, how they might fare under different circumstances. And so, that's what the field needs. The senior scholars in the field need to say to junior scholars, it's okay to think largely, it's okay to think prospectively, and it's okay to think speculatively. You don't want to do that all the time. You want to have a balanced diet of scholarship, but your balanced diet has to include that.
Thanks. Anand.
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's partly about ways of thinking. I also think, just sort of in my sort of previous existence, I was a professor of international relations, and one of the things that always used to frustrate me was the fact that international relations scholars did the international, comparative politics or comparative public administration people did the domestic, and there was very little overlap between the two, and it was just absolutely bleedingly obvious that each bled into the other in quite profound ways. And I think it's a real shortcoming in our disciplines, actually, that when we study the you will not be able to make sense of the development of the Canadian internal market for the next 10 years without thinking about the United States. And I think that's true of so many exercises. The same is true of the European single market. And I think one of the things we need to do is be able to think across disciplinary boundaries a bit more clearly than we do at the moment.
I'm going to gather a few questions, if I may, because we're coming close to the end of the session. So there was a question here at the back.
Yep, sure. Thank you. My name is Chris Kaliba with the University of Kansas in the United States. I'd like to ask a focused question on one of the polycrises, which is the democratic backsliding. Increasingly, we're seeing the public sentiment across these westernized liberal democracies, the population's willingness to accept authoritarianism and authoritarian rule. We're seeing that in the World Values Survey, for example, and in other surveys. You've been talking a lot about design flaws and design characteristics, but we now see the rise of political parties and their leaders who are willing to exploit those design flaws. And they're using and being informed by social movements and those political parties. So my question here is, in addition to looking at regimes and designs, are we missing another key element, which is the normative and the narrative side? Have we lost the basis to examine the underlying philosophical and legal traditions that have shaped our liberal democracies over time? Do we need to re-articulate and re-envision those and present a coherent view of the administrative state, the democratic administrative state, to the general public and to these political parties and leaders? And ultimately, it's a battle of hearts and minds, and we need to be engaged in that, and I wonder what your thoughts are on that question.
Great question, and hold this up for now, because I'll gather. There's another question here.
Yeah, I'll just go very... So, as we're talking a lot about unintended consequences UK is facing after Brexit, how do we see the other side during that time? Has EU integrations been strengthened, or the states are moving in a direction like looking at the UK experience and pulling away? Yeah, that's it.
Great. And there's time for one more question if anyone else has a hand. No, I don't see anyone. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, go. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. Christian Surbar from Edinburgh Napier University. Maybe to continue with a question from to Anand, I'm very interested in your thoughts because you do speak with a lot of, high-profile people. What is actually keeping Labour from being a more progressive force, apart from reform, okay? And then maybe to Sabine, I'm interested, there are a lot of discussions with Germany being this kind of reluctant hegemon in Europe. And how do you think, based on your experience, how is German public administration and its traditions impacting this and the European Union?
Great. So lots of food for thought there. Anand, I'm going to come to you first this time.
Okay, on the question about, I never really know what progressive means. But if what you're asking is why Labour isn't being slightly more left-wing in its approach to some of the questions, I think it's really hard to know. I think basically the Labour government at the moment is obsessed with the idea that the fundamental threat to its electoral success comes from its right. And the way to deal with that is to hedge against Nigel Farage. And I think the calculation they're making is if we get to the election in 2029 and it looks like a choice between Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage, then all those people who are now telling pollsters they'll vote for the Greens or they'll vote for the Lib Dems won't. That they'll come back to Labour because it'll be a bit like a sort of second round of a French presidential. That at the end of the day, left-wing and centre-left-wing forces will rally round the anti-Farage flag and will keep Labour in power. I'm not sure they're right. I think it's quite a gamble, but I think that obsession, we know for a fact that Labour's chief of staff is someone who sort of cut his political teeth fighting the BNP in East London. And it does seem to me that that is the only playbook they know at the moment. So whether it's on Brexit or whether it's on how you talk about or deal with immigration, I think that obsession with dealing with reform is absolutely crucial. On the European Union question, very quickly, just the opposite, actually. So in terms of public opinion, what you find is a significant rise in support for European integration amongst populations in member states after Brexit. You find a lot of populist parties that were previously talking about leaving the Eurozone or leaving the European Union, looking at what was happening in the UK and thinking, that doesn't look like a vote winner. So actually diluting their programmes and their opposition to the European Union. Whether the European Union has done things post-Brexit it wouldn't have been able to do with the UK around the table. I don't think you'd have a European Defence Commissioner if the UK had a veto. I think the COVID recovery funds would have happened very differently if the UK had been around the table. Whether the EU's stronger, it's harder to say. It's lost an influential member state with a degree of diplomatic heft, so in that sense it's weaker. But it has done things without us it wouldn't have been able to do with us.
Sabine, do you want to address the
German question? There was one question on the German, how the German tradition of public administration impacts on the European Union. It's a difficult question as well, because of course you have many administrative cultures impacting on European integration. So it's not just the German one, but the European Commission is a kind of a conglomerate of different administrative cultures. But of course you're right that the big states, Germany, France, have of course a major influence on how the European Union, in particular the European Commission, legislative processes, bureaucracy are working on the European level. And I think the answer, also taking account more recent developments, is twofold. On the one hand, the German administration is a bureaucratic one. So we are working with rules, with regulations, sometimes with over-regulations. We want to have a densely regulated set of rules to solve our problems. And this is something which you can feel, of course, and see in the European Union as well. So we see much critique on bureaucracy and the bureaucratic apparatus at the European level in European legislation. So this is something which also has to do with the member states, of course, not only Germany, but France, all those, based on the classic continental European tradition of public administration based on the implementation of law. So we see it. On the other hand, more recently, in many countries, and in Germany, it's a very intense debate about how to reduce red tape, how to reduce bureaucracy, and also how to decrease bureaucratic burdens at the European level. And this is something where Germany also tries to contribute to at the European level, to inspire this debate, to also bring forward debates on reduction of compliance costs, reduction of red tape, to having European regulations less burdensome for the member countries. So I think here, Germany is influencing this debate as well, but as I said, it's not only Germany as a member state, but it's all the others as well. And here, I think our historic tradition as a Bavarian administration based on the rule of law, on regulations, has, of course, an impact.
Thank you, thank you. And finally to you, Alasdair, are we missing an opportunity for making the normative case?
So let me just make quickly a couple of points. First, let me just say explicitly that my view is that our work in the field of public administration should be explicitly grounded in a commitment to the advancement of liberal democratic values. I would say it should be explicitly grounded in a commitment to a particular form of governance that respects and promotes the advancement of human welfare expressed in the language of human rights. So, and I think we need, especially at this moment in history, to be forthright about that. Some of my colleagues are reluctant to do that, but I think that's the one thing we need to do. We need to put our cards on the table about what it is we're trying to accomplish. That's one point I would make. The second point, I've been talking about centralization and regime design, but I would make the point that what I'm thinking about is very intimately connected to this concern about creating regimes that respect liberal values. So, for example, the Chinese run a very centralized system. Two of the pathologies of centralized systems are the potential for gridlock or factionalism at the top and the potential for non-compliance or sclerosis throughout the system. Well, the current Chinese system has a solution for that. It's authoritarianism. We want to abjure that sort of remedy for those particular problems, and then the question is, how do you design systems that are going to be high-performing and resilient, given that you refuse to apply authoritarian methods? And that's why I begin to think that decentralization is the better route. So that's one instance in which I think that the idea of the conversation about centralization is connected to the normative project. Very quickly, another connection is in the American case. My view is that over-centralization in the American situation is actually corroding support for the democratic project. The United States is one of the most complex and largest polities in history. And if you were thinking in the abstract about how are we going to design a political system for such a vast, populous country, would you design a strong presidential system with a popularly elected president in a two-party system? No, probably not. That's a recipe for turning politics into a nasty Manichaean struggle. So that's another way in which I see a connection between the centralization debate and the democratization debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Alasdair, and sorry to confuse you by changing sides here. Absolutely stimulating, thought-provoking insights from all of our panelists. And if we can, first of all, thank the panel in the usual fashion, please. Now, I know you're all hungry, and we are going to encourage you to go not just down the stairs, but up across the road to the Wolfson building for lunch. But before you do that, I'm going to hand over to Steve just for a moment. Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. Do you want to say anything? No, okay, all right. Well, that was a pleasant surprise. Everyone, enjoy your lunch. Somebody lost their dinner ticket, their wristband for this evening, so I'm going to give it to colleagues at the front desk. If anyone is missing the wristband, which you will need to enter the dinner this evening, please just speak to some of my colleagues. Thank you very much again. Enjoy your lunch.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, dear colleagues, be seated. We will be starting this EGPA 50th anniversary plenary panel after the wonderful panel we had this morning before lunch. So as you all know, we are celebrating half a century of the development of the public administration community of scholars who in Europe study the various aspects of public administration and public institutions. We are very happy to be here all together for this very successful anniversary conference. Merci, Monsieur le Président. With so many participants from so varied countries in Europe and from other continents and from the various sides of Europe, which is reflected in this panel this afternoon. On the occasion of this EGPA plenary, anniversary plenary, we will also, once again, we started yesterday, pay tribute to the memory of our dear Fabienne Marron, and we will have a special moment for that at the end of this panel. It makes sense when we talk about the history of 50 years since she was involved for half of these 50 years, for 24 years, in the development of our learned society and the community of scholars, the human community and epistemic community that we form all together, generations after generations. As it was recalled yesterday in the opening, the EGPA is an idea that whose genesis started before 1975, at the end of the 60s, but Geert will tell us more about that, with several European conferences hosted at Speyer Hochschule in Germany, a special school of public administration, which is in the Rhine region and has some specific connections also with France and other countries, and is not exactly the same tradition as in former Prussia and in Berlin that were studied by Max Weber. So an interesting place Speyer is in terms of connections and making connections. Many of the important big names in those days, Morstein Marx, Heinrich Siedentopf, played a key role in that. Arne Liemans, who was the first serving president of EGPA, as from 1975 till 1987. Sabine Cassese, a very important big name from Italy, was there also, and Neville Johnson, Frederick Fernand Ridley, Kauko Sipponen, Jerzy Starodziak, Klaus König, of course, and all these founding fathers, not many mothers at that time. Things have changed, and we are so happy about it. And after Lehmanns and Cassese, Hugo van Hassel served as president in the 1990s. Jacques Ziller, my predecessor as a Frenchman, for a little period of 2 years. Ignaz Schnellen, whom I remember I met at Maastricht European Institute of Public Administration when I was seconded there. And there are other persons in the room who remember this period that the less than 20 years cannot know, famous song from Aznavour. Werner Jahn, of course, who played an important role with Geert, developing the European perspectives in public administration. Maybe you will refer to that, Geert, and there were important publications in that regard made during the last decade, I would say. Then we had, as another steward in this long chain with the steering committee members, Wim van der Donk, who was elected president of the EGPA in Toulouse when I hosted the first EGPA conference in 2010. And then he handed over to Eduardo Ongaro for 2 terms with my predecessor, and Eduardo, we worked together also with the steering committee at that time and the IIAS Secretariat, organizing wonderful conferences, including a second one in Toulouse, 2015. And since 2019, with the 2 successive teams of colleagues, we handled EGPA through turbulences, because everything now is turbulent, and maybe we are provoking turbulences ourselves. Shame on us, or proud on us, I don't know. So in that period, long period, EGPA started at with rather small conferences, and then developed, but kept its family format for long. And now we are, of course, having such big events like in Athens last year, was already a big turnover, but here we are making it much, much bigger, of course. And each time, thanks to the risk-taking spirit and team spirit of the host institutions. And when we talk of institutions, these are universities, because except a few times at a hotel, in Edinburgh, for instance, 10 years ago, or 11, we are very keen on having our conferences hosted at universities, because this is the alma mater. We are a learned society of academics, and it's really important for us to act in an academic environment and not like big conferences you may have in other countries we love and like and friends, in big hotels, because things are so big that only hotels can accommodate. I insist on that because each and every conference has been an endeavor and has been a joint venture and is and will remain between the organizing committee, the EGPA as an organization, and the ones who host and welcome us, always wonderfully, with different styles, of course, in different countries, but that's the beauty of it. All steering committees, I think, and I speak under the control of Geert, who was president of EGPA before me, we have always been keen on varying the countries, the cities, not always capital cities, but other university cities, and to go up north, south, east, west. And this is something very important, just to show that Europe, united in its diversity, of course, or disunited, like the United Kingdom, I refer to the plenary of this morning, are part of all this collective undertaking. So we are very happy to be here this afternoon for this plenary. We have 4 panelists that I'm very happy to introduce now. I will start with Patria de Julnes, who is a well-known scholar and also an expert and consultant in performance measurement, government capacity building, citizen-driven governance. Patria is a professor of public administration at the University of New Mexico, and it is in this capacity that we have invited her, the immediate past president, 2023-2025, of our dear partner association, the American Society for Public Administration, whose actual president and secretary general are also in the room. Je les salue amicalement. Patria is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA, in the US. She has worked with governments and universities in Latin America, in Europe, Spain. I know you will be in Spain soon, later on this month, to improve education and practice in public administration, building partnerships to improve government capacity, support democratic governance, etc., etc. Very long CV, I make it very short. Then Akobia here is the past president, the immediate past president of NISPACI, the network of institutes and schools of public administration and in Central and Eastern Europe. She is a dean and professor of international relations and governance at a very nice university, the Caucasus University in her country, Georgia, so Tbilisi, the capital city. And her research focused on post-conflict governance, unsurprisingly in this region of the world, on Europeanization, unsurprisingly in this country, on democratization, unsurprisingly in this country, and public administration in hybrid regimes. She has coordinated many higher education programs, including creating a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence for EU policy transposition in her country. She has also worked as a practitioner and top civil servant in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of her country. So she has this double hat that Geert likes to underline, pra-academics, as many of us. We also serve as experts, etc., etc. Then Geert, of course, emeritus professor at the KU Leuven Public Governance Institute that he contributed to establish. Of course, past president of the EGPA, past president of the IIAS, one of the biggest names in our network, in our collectivity community, with so many publications that it is not necessary to mention here again, and reflections on PA reform trajectories and complexities and the neo-Weberian state and a few other important topics. And last but not least, Paul Joyce, my dear editor, publication director of the IIAS, associate at the Department of Public Administration and Policy, University of Birmingham, visiting professor in public management at Leeds Bouckaert University, took his PhD last year from the London School of Economics and Political Science, a great publisher, a great writer, many books. On the most recent books is Strategic Management and Governance Strategy Execution Around the World, Routledge 2022. Other recent books include, with Andrew Mo, who is also in the room, Strategic Management for Public Governance in Europe 2018, Strategic Leadership in the Public Sector, several editions, Strategic Management in the Public Sector, several editions, also with our beloved and regretted Fabienne Marron and P.S. Ready, this excellent book in 2020, one of the first to be issued after the COVID crisis on good governance in a global pandemic, which contributed to the worldwide lesson learning from the experience of the pandemic. Thank you for having done that with Fabienne. Thank you to the four of you to be here with us to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the EGPA. So we have agreed on a format where we will discuss between the panelists and with the audience. So a few questions as a kind of warm-up, and then we will open to questions from the floor. So please prepare yourselves. I know it's digestion after heavy lunch. No, I'm kidding. So I'm sure you will have ideas on what we will discuss. So the first thing I would like to ask is, in nowadays world, very turbulent, transforming so quickly, what is, in your views, my fellow colleagues, the purpose and mission of learning societies in the domain of PA like ours? And I would like to turn first to Patria to start on that, and then to ECA, who are the representatives of our sister associations, and then we will, Paul, Geert, and I, add things. Please, Patria.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I know that it's tough after lunch to be sitting, but that's okay. That means that you are, the fact that you're here is that you're really engaged and very interested in these conversations, and we hope to keep your engagement. The question that he asked, I think you sent it to us back in July, and I was, I've been thinking about this thing. What is really the role? What role do we play in particular in public administration? And at least from the perspective, I want to speak from the perspective of the American Society for Public Administration, just the fact that I grew up in the Society for Public Administration, the American Society, and then just finished serving, very honored to serve as president. I just want to say that we have to keep doing, this is a very simple answer, we have to keep doing what we're doing. I mean, that's just the first thing, is that keep doing what we're doing. But the second piece of it is like, you got to put it on steroids. You got to amplify exactly what we're doing. For us, for example, at ASPA, we do have a responsibility to provide a forum to our members. We have a responsibility, And this is what we are responsible to our members. We have about 8,000 members in the society, and as a society, we provide a platform where academics, which is also what EGPA does, present their research and their findings. And then we have our practitioners who come and share their best practices. And that is a very important function that we have. The American Society for Public Administration focuses on promoting the value of public service. So again, at this time, at this moment in our lives, particularly coming from the United States, there is currently a culture war where the war is against public servants. And that's really what we hear is against public servants, against bureaucrats. And in reality, this is something that has been created by the political class. So this is the problem, though. As a society, we have this, we promote accountability, we promote professionalism, we promote ethics, and we promote social equity. The problem is that we are talking to ourselves. Okay, so we are in an echo chamber. And that is one thing that I see, but that's okay because we do have to serve our members, and our members come to us because they identify with the values that we promote: accountability, social justice, professionalism, and ethics. But then we have a responsibility, to also help to solve the problems. And while we think that we do that through our members, clearly it's not enough. And there is a huge discontent and a huge misconception about public servants. So one thing that I've been grappling with, and I know we have so many smart people here because I'm not smart enough to figure out how do we get out of our echo chamber and start talking to those who are not in the room. Because those people are making this decision and are the ones that are waging the war on public service. And the other thing that I would say is that we've been focusing, for example, on ethics. Now, there is a particular, the ethics, but then in that ethics, we need to define it more broadly because it is not just about what is legal, but it's also about what is right. And unfortunately, also, we need to, some people are weaponizing the same systems that we set up as guardrails against this, what some presentations yesterday talk about, these authoritarian regimes that are coming up. And so how do we have a responsibility to talk outside of our society. We need to continue promoting the value of the values and the value of public service, but we need to talk outside of our circle. And that may help us in some way to get more supporters, and somehow we can reach that political class that is causing, in my view, is causing these problems right now for us as citizens of the world right now, and as citizens of the United States right now. So that's been my short introduction.
Oh, thank you so much. Now I will turn to Eka with the same question.
First of all, greetings everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be part of this wonderful panel. So EGPA's 50 years, and you don't need to tell me how EGPA has positioned itself in the center of public administration, not only in Europe but globally. But I can certainly tell you how EGPA's leadership and created knowledge has helped communities in transitional countries and in countries aspiring to be Europeanized and democratized. And of course, the key question is, what is the role of the learned communities? And in normal times, it is to curate the knowledge and to create the epistemic community and network, which has been done. But in times of backsliding, like in many corners of the world, certainly in Georgia, in times of backsliding, the mission of the learned community is dual. Scholarship and protection, to protect the values and the merit-based civil service, which is under threat in many, many places. And Georgia's case is an illustration of that important mission, because in Georgia today, civil service is under a severe threat. Since December of last year, the laws have been changed in an emergency way. More than 800 civil servants were let go just for supporting Georgia's European way. There have been detentions. There are more than 80 innocent people behind the bars. And people have been in the streets protesting from the dead of winter through the heat of summer for 275 days to support Georgia's European way. And I think the role of professional learned societies, like Patricia has said, is to support people, professionals who need this assistance the most by continuing what our professional networks like NISPACI and EGPA have been doing, but to also definitely come out of the echo chambers and be more proactive in supporting, in researching the empirics of what is happening in Georgia, in continuing to write about how autocratization happens overnight or over a very short period of time, because as you well know, Georgia has been a trailblazing, reforming and performing country in Eastern Partnership, which is EU's neighborhood format, which was mainly about integration with the European Union. But since December 2023, now our country is a candidate country, but also at the same time, the fastest deteriorating legal and political situation in the country. So definitely do what we are doing, but do it more and more outside the confines of the academia, into the policy world and into the world of activism to defend the values that we stand for, both professionally and normatively.
Thank you so much, Eka, for sharing with emotion, and it is understandable, this double mission of scholarship, developing research and knowledge, but in a time of more darkness, knowledge production is not enough, unfortunately, and you stress that point also. We need to go towards outside people, and even to start with our students, because in many cases we lecture them and we tell them things on the grounds of common sense, agreed knowledge, which is not anymore common sense. So we also have to question on our common sense. It is not only in Georgia that there is democratic backsliding, there is also democratic backsliding among educated students in very old democracies like France, like Italy and others, to quote only a few. And this is a real concern for probably how we produce science, not only for ourselves and our nice epistemic communities, but how we manage and we reach out more and more, what many of us try to do in different capacities, and many of yours, many of us, but it's not easy, and we know it takes time. We have the impression among colleagues that less and less colleagues want to give interviews to the media, because you waste all an afternoon for 5 minutes on TV, etc., many reasons. And I think this poses a question of the social, la fonction sociale, as we say in French, the social role and the democratic role of academics, even though they are not entering into elected politics. Paul, here, do you want to comment on what has been said already? Paul, maybe.
I would like to say one or two things about this. I think, again, I feel strongly for our colleague. These are difficult times, and they're getting more difficult. I think this is the time when we need to recognize that many people who come to these conferences are based in universities. Not everybody is, but many people are based in universities. And already our universities have changed a lot. In the old days, they were ivory towers. And we prized our rigor, and I do still. I still believe in being scientific. I still believe in trying to understand through science. And that was the cornerstone of rigor. And I think somehow we thought we had to stay in our ivory tower, otherwise we would lose our rigor. But nowadays, the modern university has to be relevant too. And to be relevant, we have to interact. We have to interact with each other around the world as academics to have a better understanding of how things are developing and continue to develop. And we also have to interact within our countries with other groups, other sections. We can't be an ivory tower, and we have got to interact, but we've got to hold on to the rigor and our desire to be a scientific association.
And it's not easy at all, because when you start to go on a TV show and you want to be rigorous, and you have facing to you people who are populist leaders, etc., and well, it's very complex, isn't it? Geert, do you want to comment on that point? Or?
I think so.
Please do.
I will stand. I think I like this audience here because the center is more populated than the two extremes. And I think that's what we need for the future in Europe and beyond Europe. And I think there are three types to answer this question or this problem for the future of our responsibilities for the future. The first is, and it was mentioned this morning in the plenary panel too, it's our duty to really stand up for democracy, to stand up for the rule of law, to stand up for human rights. If we don't take that position, we can close our books. So that's the first thing I want to say. It's the responsibility of EGPA to stand for that and to make it explicit. Then we come to the real operational things, so to speak. PA versus society, in society, academics and pracademics and practitioners together. I think we should look at comparative issues. In space, within Europe, compare. We have shared problems, we have differentiated solutions. But we have to go beyond Europe, because looking at ourselves can be fun and say, oh yes, look how good we look. We have to compare beyond Europe. And it's a learning exercise. And the learning exercise is important. And it's in two ways what we can learn from others. That's comparing in space. We have to compare in time. We have to compare past, present, and we have to compare ourselves with the future. We have to have ideas about where to go to. And those that know my thoughts, it's about utopias too. Utopia and uchronia. We have to say, where are we going to steer our systems? We have to have a normative position in this. We are social scientists. Yes, we are scientific. Yes, we should be thorough and methodological. But we are in social sciences, so we have to make choices. And I mentioned the choices at the beginning of my intervention. That should be the framework. And that should be the second layer in society, where we interact academics, pracademics, and practitioners, because always we had conferences also in national schools, too, in some cases. So that's also a risk. The third lever for our EGPA and our community is the academic disciplines. Public administration is not a discipline. It's a field. It's a field where academic disciplines come together. And we should be there to host, to bridge, to accommodate, to organize dialogues between the disciplines. And that's easy said, that's not easily done. How many lawyers are here in the room? Don't be ashamed. Luckily, there are lawyers in the room. But we need other disciplines too. I think in PA, certainly under the pressure of public management, we were very skillful to oust the lawyers. But we should bring them back. But of course, they should adjust themselves to also a bit to realities. To say, you know, let's work together. The legal frames are important. And then, of course, political science and the new sciences too, the data sciences, and I shall not mention more. I think these are three elements, so to speak. We should consolidate, and we should be a hosting platform for communication between disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you, my dear Geert. Now I think it's time for the little video that has been prepared on the history of the EGPA.
Would it be possible to say something after?
Yes.
Autumn of September 1974, Speyer, Germany, EGPA held its constituent meeting, a moment that would lead to its official establishment in 1975. European scholars and practitioners came together with a shared purpose to strengthen contacts and exchanges focused on the specificities of public administration in the region.
For 50 years, EGPA has brought people together to rethink public administration in Europe. A journey of knowledge,
Community,
and commitment.
For 5 decades, EGPA expanded across Europe
And established strong relationships with other major learned societies and regions.
EGPA has remained relevant during critical times.
And is more relevant than ever. What began as a small working group within IIAS has become the major learned society for public administration in Europe.
Its unique permanent study groups cover the most relevant topics in the field, bridging tradition and renewal. EGPA hosts dialogues and special tracks, partnering with distinguished institutions across the globe, and brings together more than 600 participants every year for its annual conference.
EGPA is not just an academic forum. It's a community where researchers become collaborators,
Where young scholars find mentors, where we grow, belong, and build together.
Celebrating 50 years is just the beginning.
We build bridges across countries, disciplines, and generations.
We are future ready.
We are globally engaged.
And we are human-centered.
Patria, you wanted to add a footnote to what was said.
Yeah, especially, first of all, this is such an inspiring, 50 years and then now 50 more. And one message that has been, I think, that I've heard over and then again now with Geert is this idea of standing up for the rule of law and human rights, but we have to stand together. And I think as learned societies, we need to present a united front, because what we have seen in the history of the world and in the history of authoritarianism is that they can conquer us faster when we are divided. So I think I am very proud, for example, of the relationship that ASPA has had with EGPA, and how we have, how we have maintained it, and how we have this singleness of mind when it comes to the values that we believe really underlie our association, and that we believe that are necessary for a better society. So a united front, as you're saying, is important, because otherwise it's divide and conquer.
Okay, thank you. So, Geert, how has EGPA in the past 50 years contributed to this agenda? Could you please tell us a bit more of this history?
Yes, I think to understand the history of EGPA, you actually have to understand part of the history of the 20th century and how that has evolved. And IAS was founded in 1930, and it was supported by the Belgian government. I'm not mentioning this because I'm myself a Belgian. It was during the League of Nations, where Belgium said we want to contribute to peace. The peace issue was very important. How can we contribute to peace? To have very professional bureaucracies in a democratic context of a state. And so the Belgian government said from now on we host IIS. And then, of course, we think we live in times of turbulence, which is, of course, right. But when you are in the 1930s and you look ahead, then suddenly there is the Second World War, huge turbulence. And after the Second World War, we had the Cold War and we had the decolonization. And so it actually meant that within IAS, the number of countries added and added, which was a very fortunate thing to do, to say we have a shared agenda to build a professional state which is supporting citizens in a legal framework. And within Europe, there was then, because of these numbers of countries that were added to in IAS, to say, we have a European identity. And within Europe, there is a need to create a platform for the European audience and for the European academics and practitioners. And that was when, in 1975, and the video, really, it's a great video, I must say. Congratulations to the Secretariat. I think it's a great video to share. It started in 75, and it is not a coincidence it started in Germany, in Speyer, after all the things that have happened in Europe. And so from there on, it was becoming part of an intellectual project to build capacity in society from the state at all levels with the universities and practice, and to develop it in a professional way. And so you see when EGPA evolved in numbers and in quality, it's very important to see the backbone of EGPA, which are the permanent study groups. At one moment in time, the the European Union, the Commission decided to have European money for research. And there was a green book that said, biomedical and technology, they're doing fine. Social sciences are weak because there is no capacity. There is no capacity to write proper projects and to write solid projects. And we had to increase the capacity there. And so the strategy of EGPA has been to create permanent study groups to enhance the capacity to be able to create strong networks, academic networks, to apply for European money, to have outputs of research, to feed this back in publications. Paul will talk about this, I'm sure he will. And so that created a kind of upward spiral of capacity and relevance around topics to do that. And so it's not just the content, the choice of the topics of the permanent study groups, but that's really the backbone, I think, of the conference, and it's also a bit different from other associations and organizations. A second thing is, if you want to have a European voice in the world, and I think we need this, and perhaps we need it even more for the future, you just don't look only in the mirror. You look to others. I mentioned the comparative research. And the dialogues became very important. And a dialogue is not one monologue, and it's not two monologues. A dialogue is really a cross-section and listening to others. And so the strategy of the dialogues was first to start with ASPA, with the Americans. And at a time, actually, where Europeans didn't like the Americans too much. There are some of these fluxes, you know, hate, love, hate, love, hate, love. It was a hate moment at that time to say, you don't dialogue when you love one another. Of course, you dialogue even without words. When there is a kind of downside, you start the dialogue to say, let's talk, let's sit together, let's have a coffee or whatever. And then, so the ASPA was a very important vis-à-vis also to learn from, to professionalize and to exchange. And then, of course, Europe and the US is one part, but the US has another part. It's Central and Eastern Europe. And it was NISPAC, and I welcome also the NISPAC leadership here in the audience. I think NISPAC is a crucial part of Europe, of Central and Eastern Europe. And so the dialogue between EGPA and NISPAC became very important to have this site here. I think it's an important issue. And then there was a third dialogue which we needed in Europe, US, Central and Eastern Europe, the South, the Mediterranean, since the Romans. The Mediterranean became very important. It was a very tough type of dialogue, I must say, because the other side of the Mediterranean doesn't have an organized vis-à-vis. You have to actually look country by country. And it also allowed, on the European side, to really have all the countries of the Mediterranean around the table, which is not increasingly, which is not always possible, and as you know, with the current situations, becomes very problematic. But I think it's essential, because one of the things of EGPA is also to bring people together beyond the Council of Europe and to have these dialogues here. The three dialogues are essential, and Euromed was expanded also to beyond the Euro-MENA here. I think to correlate with the evolution of Europe is important. EGPA has been growing and evolving and correlating with the European project as such. We also had added the accreditation. Quality of education and training becomes very important. And we had a permanent study group to study what is quality and how can we think of education and enhance education here. And the European Association of Public Administration Accreditation, I welcome also the leadership there, has been a crucial element here to extend and to support the education of our civil servants, our students for the future. We also had, I will say, during my presidency, one project that failed. We like to talk about success, but one failed. It's Babel, the Babel project. Because we have 27 countries and we have 23 official languages in the European Union. And if you go further on, it's even more. And we speak English now, and we think we understand one another, and we think we speak well, or English well, don't we? Yes. And so I think the local languages are important. And we have to keep these cultures and our journals, our local journals. So the Babel project, I will tell you what a failure was. So was to have a database only with the titles and the abstract in the original and in English, and to bring it together in a database, update it, so people could Google and could go to the website and say, prisons, quality, whatever, and find an article in Finland and an article in Italy and contact the researchers and see how that brings together. Babel has two types of definition. Suddenly, we speak different languages and we understand one another. Or the confusion of Babel, which we have to avoid, of course. EGPA has two official languages, English and French, and that's a historical part, of course, but I think it's important to keep this diversity of languages within EGPA. I think it's a crucial element of our administrative cultures, because that's part of the identity of public administration too, in plural here. I think that's what I'm trying to tell. Thank you.
Merci, mon cher Geert. Paul, how does this success story reflected in the publications?
I think I've got the hardest job here. Yes. Yeah. You can imagine over 50 years the number of articles that have been published by the International Review of Administrative Sciences. It's a lot. You can imagine the number of books. I printed them all out, the titles. It's a great deal of books. So I gave up on that idea of trying to highlight some as outstanding or special. And I think I've got this formula for you, that the thing about all the articles in IRS and in the books, both the in-house books we publish and the Palgrave Macmillan series, is that if you look at them, you see that what EGPA has been doing has been evolving. I would say it's been agenda setting, and I would say it's been influential, not episodically, but continuously. And I was looking at how quickly IRAS reacted to developments recently. Where they took, for the IRAS, they took a special issue based on the Athens conference, and there's a curated set of papers based on that conference, picking up the conference theme. So taking the debates that were going on in the study groups and in the plenaries and so on, and pushing it out through the journal that quickly, really quickly. The quickness in terms of being ready for the 50-year celebration with a virtual special issue. And actually, if you look into that, which I did, I looked into the special virtual IRS, and there's some wonderful articles in there, and it shows you what a treasure trove of research and scholarship over the years, not just recently, and it continues. It keeps on evolving. We, as you all know, we try to promote comparative work, but I think we're also at a stage where we're combining the focus on comparative work with deep dives into particular countries and their public administration. 2019, it was a book on Switzerland, and what was wonderful about it, it was in collaboration with the Swiss government. Then, 2 years later, there was a book on public administration in Germany, and what was wonderful about it, in collaboration with government. And Finland and Italy, there's just no containing the Italians. We're now at 3 volumes of public administration, and it's wonderful, wonderful scholarship. And you know, this sits side by side with this collaborative thing. We need to understand countries deeply, and obviously not just in Europe, but around the world, to enrich our collaborative work. I was looking through some of the books I found interesting, and this is not to say they're the best, and perhaps I shouldn't do this in case it looks like I'm picking the best. But I looked at one that interested me because it had stuff on transformational leadership. It was edited by Victor Beckers and others, called Innovation in the Public Sector, but it had this transformational leadership stuff that I'm still interested in. And it appears this was study group 1. There was another book which I think does ring true for today, is The Integrity of Governance. And this was by Leo Huberts, 2014. And we're not just about talking about public administration, it's also about those values, that integrity that public administration needs. And I'm going to mention Eduardo Ongaro's edited book, Public Administration in Europe, which had contributions from right across EGPA. It was a real collective effort to produce that. And I've been checking into it. Firstly, I've discovered it's very widely accessed. It's used in courses and policy debates. So I think there is a continuing relevance. And I just want to finally, having said that there's this treasure trove in the journal and in the 2-book series that we have, I want to say, just echo, I've been thinking about this. Why is this working so well? Why has it worked so well for a time? And I think we're probably quite strategic. I would say that, wouldn't I? I would say that. But, you know, I think we've found some devices, some mechanisms for focusing the work of European academics in public administration, and they're called the permanent study groups. And we found devices for interacting. One of those is interacting with colleagues around the world. And they're things like the transatlantic dialogues. So, you know, we've organized for this. This is not an accident that it works so well. I should stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the 4 of you. I think we are running out of time, so I would like to have the video in memory of Fabienne Mahon, and to end up after it, not by a minute of silence, because she was not so protocol, but a big round of applauses, and then we will run to our panels. Please, the video for Fabienne. to Fabienne. Thank you very much to all, and especially to the guest panelists. Have a nice afternoon. See you at the gala dinner. This conference is dedicated to Fabienne anyway. She's with us in spirit.